talk about two different things here, or we could just end up talking so much like last time that I barely get to my second module. But the first series of plots, this is an actual experiment. We're in our final year of an Ultra Early project on seeding that we've coined Ultra Early. And then we're going to talk about management intensity at the end there if we have time. And a lot of the context around even this, and then as we finish up over there, I mean, we're in the semi-arid prairies, but prairie-wide, we've been dealing with a pretty bad drought for the most part. And so one thing that should be top of mind for everybody, regardless of where you reside on that industry value chain, is like managing that abiotic stress. So how can I build a system of wheat on my farm that's the most resilient in terms of resistance to abiotic stress? And the thing to think about, because I'll probably forget it, is to think about the intangibles, because we're going to talk about seeding rates, we're going to talk about seed treatments, we're going to talk about things like that, and you're going to come back and tell me, I didn't see that. I didn't see that over here that one year I did a strip trial kind of thing. And yeah, there's a lot of times where I can't guarantee the world in terms of yield advantages or anything like that, but what we see almost always is the superior systems that we advocate for give us better system stability, meaning field to field, year to year. You may not have gangbusters yields, but in extreme drought, it's probably the only thing that actually gave you anything. And in really good years, it probably gave you more than the rest. And in medium years, maybe it gives you just those intangibles that you don't see. So it's something to think about there. So in that context of that, and then, you know, the reality is you don't have to be a climate activist. You don't have to be a climate denier. But the fact is we can get on the land earlier for the most part in a lot of areas of the prairies. And so can we do anything to take advantage of that? Because if we can do that, we're probably paying for it in a way, and usually around the way is water, and less of it potentially, or less of it when we prefer to need it in the traditional sense of when that crop stage is happening. So that was a little bit of background into kind of what we do with my program here at Lethbridge. I've been with Ag Canada now 33 years. Not that I'm counting the years down or anything, but 2/3 or more of that has been running my own research program that we started from scratch, and it started with a lot of wheat work. And at the time, ironically, in that situation, it was trying to stabilize yields in an environment of severe wheat stem sawfly outbreak, and we had no entomologists working on it, when back in the 40s and 50s, there was probably a team of 10 to 12 just here. But they all thought problem solved, never come back, and so on. And if you saw my tweet yesterday, you might even see one flying around here, which is kind of early for them. So be prepared, I guess. So why ultra early seeding systems? Way back when, 2012, because of that sawfly work, I was going down to talk at Montana State at a conference down there. And the guys in Montana were already on the land, and this is the end of March, first week April, something like that. And nobody was turning a wheel here. And I mean, the 49th parallel has conditions similar on both sides. And it kind of light bulb moment was like, you know, why can't we get on there earlier? Or at a minimum, why can't we get on there with some research and figure out if there's any way to exploit that environment, right? Because, you know, the other thing we'll talk a lot about today is like the synergy of a system when you can properly combine, you know, your management, which is all the agronomics, with genetics, against certain environmental conditions. And this is that G by E by M that we talk about, genotype by environment by management. Fancy word for systems agronomy. So that was kind of like, and so what I was thinking then at that time is, okay, I got to go talk to Rob Graff, and I got to get some cold tolerant genetics from him, because there's no way the environment that would be present there, those super cold soils, there's no way our wheats would survive in that. They're gonna, because the mindset back then was like, well, you can't go that early. It's just gonna sit and rot in the ground, and game over. So I talked to Rob. I got some cold genetic lines from him. I compared it to some hard red spring wheat lines, just a Stettler, to see what we would do. And so then the thing was, okay, it's a great idea, but how are we going to develop a concept, a system of practices that could be replicated if we had success? And that, I think, has been sort of the thing that's been missing, the knowledge gap, is like, oh yeah, I seed early. Well, what does that mean? Well, I can seed second week of April. Okay, great. Which year was that? Because the second week in April last year compared to this year, compared to 5 years ago, is completely different. But we're in a mindset of calendar dates that I would argue has been driven a lot by crop insurance and things like that. So as a farm kid around here, it's the culture, the mindset was, well, if I'm in with my cereals by May 10th, I'm good, because crop insurance said so. And it's like, so biologically, May 10th is the same as April 10th, is the same as March 10th, and so on? No. And so that was the missing thing there. So what we came up as an idea is like, okay, I want to start at when the soil temperature in the top 2 inches is 0 degrees. Any earlier, I knew probably wouldn't be a good practical in terms of being able to get on the land. So it was just an arbitrary thing of let's start at 0. And then the original experimental design is further down there. We just went in 2 degree increments, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And if you looked at the literature back then, or sort of provincial guidelines, they would put out numbers like, well, seed won't germinate until soil is like 17 degrees, 20 degrees, some quoted cooler ones, but nothing like 0, or nothing recommending that you go in at 2 degrees or whatever. And so that's where we came up with this ultra early seeding. And then the soil temperature trigger, the prescriptive practice there was no matter what day or month, as soon as you see and register that mid-morning, no matter what happens after, that's your soil temperature trigger to start planting. And so that was kind of the start of it all. And so what we found was this was kind of our sweet spot. Anything over 0 and 2 degrees ended up being the real sweet spot, because we're like, 40, we must be close to 50 plus site years now. So we've got a generation of data now, not a couple of site years at Southern Alberta. It's been done as far north as Dawson Creek too. And it's not like, oh, Dawson Creek, they can get in at 0 or 2. No, but they were getting in a hell of a lot earlier than anybody there ever was. Because it wasn't because they couldn't, it was the culture of like, you just can't do that. Like, you can't do that. That's insane kind of thing. So now the question is, obviously the field conditions have to allow you to get in and plant. The second thing is, how do we buffer ourselves against that abiotic stress of cold soils? And the one thing that was happening, so this is 2013 when we first got our first project proposal funded. But at the same time, we were doing one on seed treatments in winter wheat. And what we found there, because the theme of that particular project in winter wheat was optimizing stand establishment and stabilizing stand establishment in winter wheat. Well, what did we find? If you use a dual fungicide insecticide seed treatment, you will have significantly more plants in the field. You will likely improve your overall yield, and you most definitely stabilize your yield. And so it was just a non-starter for us. If we're going to go in this cold, we're not going to shoot ourselves in the foot by not having seed treatments on this. And so, neonics, particularly back then, were getting quite demonized in terms of what the implications of what they had on collateral damage to beneficial insects and so on. But the reality was some tweaks were made in how well it would now stick to the seed versus kind of dusting off. And the fact is, this isn't a foliar neonic application either. So the value of that neonic component on a seed treatment versus what we would lose if we lost it, to me was tremendous. And there are dual fungicide onlys that do okay in terms of giving you enhanced frost cold tolerance, but still the best is the combination of the two. So if you haven't done that, haven't worked with that with clients or whatever, something to think about, because that to me is low-hanging fruit in terms of what it does from what we learned with our studies. And so that's why automatically it was in here.
Sorry, you said that was in your fall and spring apply? You did the dual treatment?
No, it's just the dual fungicide insecticide seed treatment. We initially did the research in winter wheat, and with this one we didn't even have it as part of our factorial thing. It was just like everything's getting it, because there's other things we want to look at. We 100% were convinced as a preconceived bias that I would need cold tolerant genetics, which we didn't. Stettler did just as good as everything else, and you'll see here too. The same thing with Durham, we're seeing the same thing. So lucky for us, or for me specifically, I was able to recruit a PhD student in Graham Collier, who you might know from New Farm, and so he had to come up with some of his own ideas too, and so he expanded what we saw with Stettler to every spring wheat class, and then he also looked at pre-plants, because that's the other thing to this, right, is like, well, the earliest we've gone with 0 degrees here is February 9th. There's not a lot growing in February 9th. Take it from me in case you haven't been out there. So a pre-seed glyphosate, that traditional practice is now out the window. So he looked at things like, fall applied pre-plants, and that sort of thing, which they're quite compatible. You just got to watch it with Durham. You can't use, I believe it's the pyroxasulfone with Durham. I mean, technically you could even apply it later if you did some pre-planting on that particular field and you had the window, because the big thing you want with those pre-plants is you need a good rainstorm to come and wash it down, because you don't incorporate it. You just spray it on and let the moisture take it down, and then let the seeding practice take care of the rest. And so that's been quite good. And the other thing to talk about in terms of the competitiveness too of an ultra-early seeding practice is, like, you do kind of get some of the benefits you would from a winter wheat system. Like this one at 0 to 3 there, versus where Ryan's standing was something I would argue was more common back in the day of, I don't know what those ones are, the 7.5 or 10 degrees or whatever when they were planted. So you've got a plant here that's actually starting to flower, and it's right June 26th. So what we have now is we have just about our entire crop shifted in terms of a critical growth period out of July. And that is huge, because when we start getting temperatures of 30 plus in wheat, what happens is you get floret abortion. And so your seed count, seed number goes down. What's one of the main factors of yield components for your yield? Well, it's seed set and seed number. And so that, to me, if you're asking, what's the advantage? Well, that's kind of the one, is I think what we've done, it's kind of hard to measure, but we've shifted that critical growth period, and that's why we're getting the success. It's not just because it's looking all, first out of the box, looking great. It's because that flowering is going to be over before those high temperatures and heat stress hit us. But where Ryan's standing, they're going to get hit square in the forehead with it. So that's one benefit. Yeah?
Would you increase your seeding rate because you're going earlier just in case there is a bit of a frost? Or do you just...
I wouldn't go high just to go high. I mean, I would go high because I know I'm going to get, with our work on seeding rates, you're going to get higher yield stability anyway, regardless of when you go. We obviously want a little bit higher seeding rate in winter wheat, for example, so it would kind of go to theory, to your point. Well, these would probably do better at a little bit higher rate. But if you're not planting at 40 seeds per square foot, your spring wheat, we definitely want you doing it in something like this. And some guys will say, and they did in the last session, it'll never work. That rate's too high. I don't know for sure two things. One, because they talk about target plant density. Well, we all talk about target plant density, and I'll tell you from a scientist, the plant density I want to see at the end of the day is at a minimum 20 plants per square foot, but if I'm pushing 30, that's good too. How did I get there? Well, I had a target plant density. Well, what the hell does that mean? You have no control over what happens after that seed exits that boot jack. So it's all about the seeds going in. And so how many seeds going in over years and fields and years on average did it take for me to get there? And I think that's what gets lost, because that side-by-side I did showed me I could cheat back or not. And so I'm an advocate of higher seeding rates anyway. And yeah, and something like this, they definitely pay their way for sure. Now where Ryan's standing, now he's going to move because he's all shy. Now what are the others? So we've got intangibles, like this one's going to be off earlier. Some will say, well, I don't know, like the droughts we get, I think I'm better off waiting until we get the moisture. So some guys will wait till almost June 1st and plant. Well, what if it didn't come? What if you encountered another problem that caused a train wreck? If I had gone in here, I might be able to do something with that piece of land, but I'm sure as hell not going to do something when I started working that land or playing around with it June 1st. So I would argue that, you know, some of the intangibles are like winter wheat. You get some of those benefits of being earlier. You're out of the field earlier in the fall. More often than not, you're going to get higher yield. And the one thing we can never really see is that yield stability. We don't think about it enough as far as I'm concerned. But how about financial consequence? If I said to you, if this was the benchmark now, and this gave me in southern Alberta, right here in Lethbridge, and we did the numbers, if this gave me a certain net return or whatever, how much did I lose with that one by Ryan there? Same variety, everything else, but I waited. What did I lose in dollars per acre? Who wants to guess? You too can own one of these shirts. Whoever gets the closest guess. $100 an acre. That's a bold answer. Anybody else? 5.
Yeah, I laughed at that because he said 100.
So we've got an optimist and we got a pessimist. Anybody in between? 25. 35.
110.
Well, now you're making me try to convert this to hectares. All right. Well, I think that 100 is the one. Pretty close to it. So which size are you? Large? All right. Hang on. Okay. Come up and get your t-shirt. And I won't be the only cool kid on the block. I'm a big fan of AC/DC, so you can have one too. Okay, so yeah, I'm talking my face off here. So we talked about rate, depth, seed treatments, the advantages of going early, and we've got different varieties here. Defy, I've got no stake in CDC Defy, but so far, what we're seeing with varieties is it started off where Defy was significantly better than the other varieties we have here. And then I don't know if it was the drought and we just didn't get the magnitude of change because of that and everything squeezed together. But it's kind of even now. But I think you'll see that among everything else, obviously, I think this one looks the best in terms of going ultra early. But variety-wise, I still think Defy might be a little bit better. You can decide yourself. We'll just mosey down to this next flag. One other thing I forgot to mention. So we started to show the success of ultra early seeding. And if you know the farmers I know, the first thing one of them said to me was like, yeah, that ultra early, that works. That works, man. How about dormant seeding? I'm like, what are you talking about? Well, what if I planted my durum in October. I'm like, why don't, if you're going to plant wheat, why don't you just plant winter wheat? Because I did a lot of winter wheat work in my day. But he's like, no, I want to plant, I want to plant my spring wheat. So I was like, go to hell. I'm not going to tolerate that. But I relented. And so in this particular experiment, we've added in what we call a dormant seeded spring wheat. And so, okay, now back to a prescriptive practice. How do you do that, right? Because I think some guys will try that. And it turned out when we were planning this, I got a call from a crop consultant. He had a guy in Rolling Hills that was going to put in a quarter of durum in October. And I was like, just hold them off a little bit. I think it's too warm. And because when you think about durum will generate or germinate, theoretically it could germinate at 3 degrees. So I wouldn't be planting in October if it was 5 degrees because it's all going to come up potentially or sprout enough where it's going to like die off. And so our prescriptive practice here, what we're calling dormant, is as soon as the soils cool in the fall to equal to or less than 2 degrees, we plant. And what that's meant for us with these has been usually that third week of November. And what we've found, our experiences to date with this, is that generally what we're seeing there is probably almost a binary outcome where it's either looks like this, which isn't bad actually, or it's a total train wreck. So that's kind of been our experience. I sure as heck wouldn't be saying forget about ultra early planting and go all in on dormant. That's not what we're saying at all. I'm not saying anything about this other than this is our experience. If you want me to put money down on something, it's that over there. The other question would be, and you could answer me too, I won't give you a shirt for it, but a question we had is always is like, okay, what about depth, right? So we had one study where we compared 1 inch to 2 inches, didn't really see any difference there at all. But with 3 inches, what do you think would happen versus 1, for example?
More winter death. Like more death.
Or what?
Less survivability.
With what?
With a deeper.
Okay.
That doesn't look like a win.
Well, you're not getting a shirt.
Are you talking dormant seeding or are you talking early, ultra early?
Well, why don't you tell me what you're thinking?
Well, ultra early, if you're going 3 inches, it's going to emerge 4 weeks from when you, or even longer, right? It's going to take forever to come out of the ground. Versus 1, right?
But do you want that?
Well, if you're planning...
It's February 9th, and you're putting in your...
Yeah.
Well, you weren't.
Depends
but,
what kind of spring you got, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm still kind of in that thing where that 1 inch to 2 inches is superior, but we did sort of see, like with the 3 inch, with their, not including this year, but if you went dormant, the deeper was better. And intuitively, it kind of makes a little bit of sense, right? Because you probably insulated a little bit better from the variability. But then, I don't know, you tell me, I'm looking at the 3 here with the dormant compared to, what is it, the 1 inch. And I don't know, that 1 inch isn't looking too bad either. So yeah, to your point, it's the environment, but to my point with all this is we should be thinking about not the environment, but collectively say the 10 environments, because that's what I told the guy earlier. It's like, okay, are you farming for 2 out of 10 years? Or are you farming for 8 out of 10 years? Because you're going to get a totally different outcome after 10 years. And you're going to make a lot more or a lot less. So that's what you kind of need to be thinking about when you're adding or deleting practices, or you're, trying to put in some risk of what I'm comfortable with. Is, okay, farm for those 8 out of 10 years. You're going to get your ass kicked 2 out of those 10, at least. But what buffered you the best? And out of the 7 of the 10, when you had opportunity, did you exploit it or did you blow it? That's...
You're going into like frost. So you're into a layer of moisture when it melts, right? Like that, at least there's some guy from up in the east. Like what Christina's doing up there, people, they're wanting to go that deep.
Oh, they are? Yeah, well, I'm not gonna criticize that.
It doesn't make sense, so I'm still...
Well, sometimes a lot of what we do is counterintuitive. I put that...
Soil texture make a difference though?
Well, yeah. I mean, ultimately, you need good seed to soil contact, and you don't want to be pulling up huge aggregates. So there's the 3-inch. I don't know, I must have been standing in front of the 1-inch or something. So I don't know. That's not looking too bad. Maybe it did give us something there too. And then these are just the different varieties with the same approach. Ultra early versus later versus later versus latest with different varieties, and then ending off with the dormant of each variety.
Is there a bigger, so are you seeing winter, like you've seen it die, do you think 2 out of 10, Brian, or do you think it's almost, like you're pretty sure that it's 90% of the time it's probably the
What, ultra early?
Yeah,
I'd say
how
it's 10
often-
out of 10.
You really haven't had hardly any failures.
No.
It's almost, and then
That
spring
2
versus-
degrees, we really haven't. I mean, somebody was saying, oh, you know, I'll wait till June. I'm like, go ahead, go wait till
You're
June.
losing, like you say, but now on spring wheat versus Durham, but you're doing it with Durham and it's working good because Durham was always
Yeah.
seen as,
I know, and that's why we did it here, because that was the question.
Right.
And
If
then
it works with Durham, it's for sure going to work for spring
Yeah.
wheat.
And we are doing this with barley. We got that funded, so we're
Okay.
going to see what barley's going to
You
look
haven't
like
done
too.
much on barley yet.
None.
Okay,
We're going to start next year,
good.
I think. Yeah.
Here they all.
There's more over there. We've even got that Desire. You heard of that one?
Desire.
That'd be the earliest Durham out there.
Okay.
But nobody really picked it up. But you know, you talk about varietal differences. So you saw that flag back there
Yeah.
was Defy at 3 inches.
Right.
Dormant planted, but here's Transcend, right? So was there something shitty going on here?
Yeah, something.
Possibly.
Yeah, it makes you wonder. Yeah.
But Transcend overall right here doesn't look as hot
No.
as, and it's actually in the lower spot, although they're watering the heck out of it too, so it doesn't matter that that's a high spot, I guess.
Are you seeing differences in stubble height, like for survivability? Mind you, you said it's almost always surviving, but do you see any benefit to higher stubble?
Well, I would say potentially, yeah.
There we are, I guess.
Now, is it doable with a stripper header?
Yeah.
Because now can you get in at the same time in that
Well,
field? Probably
we've been
not.
wanting to do this, but it's been like we just haven't been able to. We've got snow in the field in our stripper ground,
Yeah.
like almost all winter. So can you seed through the snow and do a decent job of seed placement?
Well, I don't know.
I don't know.
That'd depend a lot on your opener
We've
and the
done
weight of
like
your.
with a disc drill, see the camelina that way, where you're literally going through the snow, and it's
Really?
just funny as heck. Like all people are pulling over on the highway, like, what are you doing? And we're seeding through snow and we're putting the seed right.
I'm
on
doing
top
what
of
I
the snow
always
in the
do.
ground. As soon as it warmed up in March, like we had a beautiful stand. So
Really?
could you do that with wheat?
Well, you could. It's like I say, it all goes back to, did you get good seed to soil
Seed to soil
contact, or with
contact.
that disc, was it pulling where you leave it up ribbons of soil, probably with some seed stuck to it. I've seen that
It was
before.
pretty cold. Like it's nothing
Yeah.
was really sticking.
Okay, lastly with this stop is a seed grower out of southern Saskatchewan talked to me. He's a big winter wheat advocate, and one thing they struggle with there is when they want to plant winter wheat on time, it's often impossible in terms of, it's not just the fact that there's no moisture, it's the fact that it's so hard that it's really difficult to get in, plant, and get good seed to soil contact. And so what he's kind of talked about is sort of something kind of in between these systems, and it's that almost a dormant planted winter wheat. So he's not going to plant his winter wheat when he's supposed to. He's going to wait until October when the rains come, which intuitively is high risk. But the other thing that he's asking us and everybody is like, okay, we've gone decades with no advancement in winter hardiness and winter wheat. And we've spent millions in the process of that. And we still have nothing comparable to North Stars, which was 80, 81 or whatever it was. So his question is, let's just forget about winter hardiness, plant our winter wheats dormantly and see what they look like. And to sort of test that, these are two winter varieties that have no winter hardiness compared to the winter wheats we have in Western Canada. So it's a sort of a double whammy of how horrible they should be in the prairies. One is a soft white winter out of Ontario, and that's a winter durum out of, I think, the States. And we planted them at the same time. I think we were doing our dormant planting. So this is like third week in November probably. And actually, you know, that winter durum doesn't look too bad. And so Dale might be onto something here, because even this one for a winter soft type out of Ontario, you know, I don't know. I would say, I haven't really asked around, but I mean, I was thinking at certain parts of this winter that the conditions were going to be pretty tough for winter wheat, because we warmed up. Well, I was in a t-shirt taking down the Christmas lights, and then February was horrible. And then we had the late cold weather. Probably not the greatest for winter wheat, but I haven't heard. Do you have any?
Yeah, and it looks okay now, but a month ago didn't look good at all. It took its toll.
Yeah. How about you?
Yeah. If the stuff that didn't get cut worms looks amazing.
Oh, right, yeah. So anyway, just this really isn't part of any experiment. It was just kind of a looky-loo that we were curious about. I'm curious about these winter durums particularly. So anyway.
Did they would have to germinate those still in the fall in order to vernalize? Or?
No, it kind of turns that whole idea on its head, where it doesn't necessarily have to. And that's why these guys that'll go in late with a winter wheat, and you end up being later the next year. Well, that's because of that, right? So but that doesn't mean you've got a train wreck either.
There was lots of winter wheat that was planted in the dry ground this year that didn't germinate,
Yeah.
or it was just barely up before
Yeah.
winter anyways.
Okay, so we'll just walk along here. There's more varieties of durum here, planted at more increments of soil temperature. And again, though, you can see for the most part that advantage of your ultra early seeding system. Right at the end there, oh no, I already talked about Desire, I think. No, I didn't. There's a really early durum down there called CDC Desire that Jeff, you didn't pick up. You should have. It looks good. It's the reason, the idea behind that one, Curtis Pozniak has an objective of trying to breed outside and kind of expand the durum production zone. How do you do that? Well, you got to have one objective at least in relation to early genetics, and that's it. Except a really early durum variety didn't really catch on. So I'll meet you down at the flags. Okay, so to wrap up, the next thing I'm sort of thinking about in terms of, winter wheat is now, we've looked at a lot of technologies. We've done the research on some of the other major limiting factors where we've dialed in a system of practices. So, if I were to say, for example, here's our regular farming practice. So a little bit later planting, a single seed treatment, no soil additives, and just going with 100% recommendation of whatever the soil test came back with, nothing super fancy. So that's kind of the benchmark of what we would try to beat with a different combination of practices that we would try to use to enhance, like I said, system stability, resilience in the face of abiotic stress and things like that. They weren't always, but I think the things that I talked about earlier, like the low-hanging fruit, I would argue, are using those dual seed treatments, a nice high seeding rate, going ultra early when you can, those sorts of things. You start pulling that together, and then it's like, okay, how does that work with the nitrogen management package? And so we're in the middle of two pretty big projects where we've ended 2 experiments and we've got 2 more going, both prairie wide. And there's some that would say enhanced efficiency fertilizers, like particularly, a nitrification inhibitor or a dual nitrification urease inhibitor. There's some zones that don't need it ever. And I don't know about that. The one thing that surprised me, I went in, because we all have our biases, right? I went in with a bias, I think, particularly with the enhanced efficiencies like that, thinking, that's an input cost that's going to be a lot. And there was even I'm not going to say who, but there was somebody in Western Producer where they were saying the premium they paid for Super U, for example, was 41% over urea. And I was like, if that's the case, boy, I don't know how that pencils out. But then we finished up our study here, and it was a totally different thing. We had to work with the heads of some of the business units for the big fertilizer companies, and you know, they've got their issues internally with their retail units and stuff on how they price stuff. So I didn't want to get caught in the middle of that, but I got some good intel, I think, on honest data there. And really what we've learned from that, I think, is that, you know, it goes back to things like seeding rates, where, you know, there comes a certain point or certain situation where you're not going to necessarily see all the time a notable yield bump. But the question is, like, were there any intangibles that you gained from it? And in our nitrogen study, there were. Like, we really did increase our yield stability with some of those nitrification inhibitors, urease inhibitors, and so on. And net return-wise, they tended to pay for themselves. So, you know, but there's not this silver bullet thing either, where like, oh, if you use it, you're going to have this and that year to year, field to field, and blah, 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 yeah?
Wouldn't you say, especially like in our soil with a 7 to 7.5 pH with less nitrogen, wouldn't you say it's more important to use it here than in the beast with a 5.5 pH, wouldn't you say?
Well, at pH where? You know what I mean? Because now we're talking about this band here, which even here, and Regis, I think, will probably talk about that, is we're having to manage the fact that now, decades after no-till, we actually do have pH gradients in our fields that do affect necessarily, potentially, what happens with that. Can have issues around salinity if you're using fertilizer with too high a salt index and it's dry down here compared to up there. You know, there's all these complicated things that work its way into that, right? And that's kind of why we went to this step now, is like, okay, enhanced efficiency fertilizers, split applications. We haven't really seen big differences with all banded versus split applied. So if you're somebody that likes to band it all and get it over with, you're not really losing out a whole lot versus the intensified practice down there. Now, I have put a couple flags in there on treatments that I would argue, to me, look the best. And with this one, we're proposing to look at all kinds of things, like unique seed coats, some of these things, these in-crop foliars that are sort of calcium blends or silica blends, that kind of thing, that potentially, no, it's not a nutrient management practice. We're trying to do it to see if we can bump up our yield stability or that sort of thing, and manage abiotic stress resistance. So that's kind of the background to this. So you can walk and take a look and see what you think. And of course, different seeding practices in terms of rates and so on, and what's going to pay. So it's just, this is more just for discussion purposes today because we haven't even started it. So yeah, this is one here that I think, you know, dual seed treatment, 40 seeds per square foot. We've even put some soil biologicals in there. The one thing about a fair question too with your enhanced efficiency fertilizers is, you know, can we pull back then our rates, save some money, because a lot of times we are seeing that advantage. So there's, you know, there's two different mindsets around that. Do I go a full rate and try and push my yields higher, close that yield gap, or do I like pull back for the sake of economic stability and still get that 100% yield target as opposed to 110 or 115% yield target? So that's kind of the question that's being framed around enhanced efficiency fertilizers as well. And so that's it. That's all I got.
Can you comment on the, I guess, your herbicide management? Because obviously if you're seeding, say, 6 or 8 weeks earlier than standard practice,
Yeah.
like especially this year in winter, you're going in, say, with a group 2 and you have cooler nights, like it was really hard to get the right amount to actually spray without flashing the crop.
Yeah.
So can you comment on that a little bit? What you guys have seen?
Well, I mean, depends on what we're talking about. I just got informed that we torched some of our canola, and we still don't know why. But in terms of specific to something like this, like I said earlier with Graham's work, like the pre-plants give us a little bit better flexibility in terms of, and they also demand a little bit more pre-planting though. So if pre-seed's not an option, and it obviously wouldn't be if there's nothing growing, then can I get in with a pre-plant? And the thing about the pre-plant, like a fierce mix or like a pyroxasulfone, flumioxazin, or something like that, is that, yeah, normally you got to apply it in the fall, but if in your, and don't quote me on this because I've probably screwed up a bit on what I'm trying to say, but you could actually go in, as long as you're like, say 2 weeks ahead of planting and you do get a nice rainfall after you've applied the pre-plant, it won't be too hot on that crop. But you've got to have the moisture that takes it down. That's why you're way safer to do it in the fall, because then you've had snow on it and yada yada before you've planted and you're good to go. And then the other thing you got to watch too with some of those, like, pyroxasulfone's too hot for durum, I believe. And so if you were doing the durum with a pre-plant, it's just got to be something like Flumi or something like that. So probably haven't fully answered your question, but that's, the other thing is, like, yeah, somebody earlier was asking about, what's a compatible stubble type? And we even learned this with winter wheat. Like, counterintuitively, actually, winter wheat can do really good on pea stubble, and even up north. We did 2 studies on that. And because you think about winter wheat and you think about snow trap potential and stuff like that, well, it's not necessarily the case, but we did have one train wreck out by Nobleford once, and now I'm in my 24th or 25th year of research. One real bad one out there where winter wheat was planted onto pretty black soil that was pulse in a drought and didn't really get a whole lot of rain after the application of the group 2, and it just smoked that winter wheat. So yeah, that carryover is a concern. You would think intuitively this year with all the rain we've had that it wouldn't be as bad, but it just depends on when you did it, when you planted, what happened in between, and that kind of thing too. We're still trying to figure out why we torched our canola, but luckily it wasn't in any of our experiments. It was more in fill areas, but yeah, some of that's happening this year. All right.
Any final questions for Brian? Okay, I'd like to thank Alberta Grains for sponsoring this session, and Brian, thank you very much for your time. If you guys
Thank
enjoyed
you,
it,
Jamie.